Has New York City won the war on crime? Actually, it once did. Let's take a look. This is Beyond the Cover with your host, Gary Benoit, and today we have with us Selwyn Duke. Welcome to the program, Selwyn.
Gary, great to be with you again. Usually I just speak to you on a personal basis, so this is a nice change.
It really is, but regardless of circumstances, it's always enjoyable. But Selwyn, you grew up in New York City, and even today, although you live outside the city limit, you don't live that many miles away. Your mother still lives in New York City, and you're very familiar with the area. And certainly you've been impacted by crime. Now, you wrote an article for the October 31st issue of the New American Magazine entitled, How New York City Won the War on Crime. And you start that article talking about a personal experience where you were a witness to a murder. And I wonder if you could go into a little more detail about that, and then after that I'd like to talk to you about what New York City did in the past in order to stop the crime wave.
Yeah, well, it really was something. I'm going back a few decades now to when I was a younger man, needless to say. But anyway, my best friend and I had this ritual where once a week or so, we would go down to Manhattan to eat Indian food. He had been seeing an Indian girl, so he was quite enamored of that cuisine. So anyway, we were doing this, and this was 1995. It was April 26th, and I was driving the car, driving along Bruckner Boulevard in the Bronx, and it was about 8:40 p.m. And all of a sudden, I hear what sound like fireworks. And of course, that's not unusual. But then my friend starts screaming from the passenger seat, a guy just got shot in the head, a guy just got shot in the head. And he starts diving below the back dashboard. Well, just about at that very moment, I see this figure walk in front of my car, and I could just see a silhouette. I couldn't see who it was dark out, but I could see the outline of a 9mm handgun. And I could tell that the person was a teenager because of his sinewy physique. And anyway, he ran off shortly afterwards. But what happened then was we stopped the car not soon afterwards, and we got out. My friend started flagging down trucks, asking them to call the police. And I went over to the victim, and he was lying in a pool of blood. He had a mortal head wound. There was no helping him. There was a huge pool of blood. Anyway, so the police came. I don't think it took too long. And we had to spend much of the rest of the night in the police station giving witness statements. And it turned out, though, interestingly, that it was a very, very big case because the man who was shot and killed was named Thomas Cuevas. He was a highly regarded Hispanic millionaire who had done a lot for the community, and he was taking out the week's receipts, $17,000. And obviously the perpetrators knew that, and they robbed him. Now, there's another interesting aspect to the story, eerie, really, Gary. You might almost think it was God's will in a way. 2 weeks later, I think it was, my friend and I were again going down to eat Indian food in Manhattan, and lo and behold, what happens? Well, his car broke down about 30 feet from where the murder occurred. Now, I say maybe this was God's will because subsequently, he and I a little bit had to spend a bit of time in that neighborhood trying to get his car repaired. And he heard some grapevine information to the effect of that it was an inside job, and he related that to the police. And there was a reward for the capture, for the apprehension of the perpetrators, $50,000 or $60,000. He never saw any of that money, but it was related to him at one point that the information he provided might have helped. So that's why I said maybe it was God's will, but very, very bizarre. The police at one point came up to my apartment in Westchester County, which is a suburb of New York City, because they were really crossing every T and dotting every I, interviewing everyone. So maybe I'm going on too long, but this is just indicative of the kind of crime that New York was beset by for a very, very long time. And at the point of this murder, it was starting to diminish, but this was just the beginning of the Giuliani administration.
Right. So Mayor Giuliani really had something to do by changing the policies with changing the crime rate for the better.
Yeah, he certainly did. I mean, I forgot to mention during my story that what was also eerie was that when we were going downtown the first time, before witnessing the murder, my friend and I were actually discussing crime in New York City, and we were bandying statistics back and forth saying, oh, the city has seen about 2,000 murders every year. We were actually talking about that. And of course, the high of murders in New York City was, I think, in 1990, 2,200 some odd murders. But subsequently, that would drop down to about 300 much, much later.
Wow.
And that was because policies had changed. Now, what happened was interesting, and this is what I wrote about in my article. Giuliani gets credit and he deserves it. But what he did was he really seized upon phenomena that had been in place for a while. For instance, there was a certain operation targeting Times Square, applying the broken window theory. And the broken window theory is the idea that if you take care of the little things, the big things will take care of themselves. If you clamp down on the small crimes, turnstile jumpers, graffiti artists, aggressive panhandlers, drug dealers, so on and so forth,
Yeah, and breaking
in the
windows.
process, yeah, you're going to catch a lot of big fish because the big fish tend to commit smaller crimes as well. And also, just as significantly, Gary, you set a tone of lawfulness. Obviously, if you start letting people get away with all sorts of things, then everything can snowball. And it sort of reminds me of that movie, The Secret of My Success, with Michael J. Fox. I know it's an obscure reference, but he descended into corruption. And towards the end of that movie, he was explaining his descent into that morass. And he said, well, you know, first I did this and it didn't seem so bad. Then I did that and it didn't seem so bad. And then I did something else. And that's the way it works. So what happened was in New York City, you had a lot of different entities that really were trying to clamp down on crime in various ways, preceding Giuliani's tenure as mayor, starting in the 70s, clamping down on graffiti artists, all sorts of things. Even Mayor Dinkins, who was a liberal mayor who preceded Giuliani, hired 6,000 more policemen, but he was late to the game, and possibly he was doing that to buttress his reelection chances. It's hard to say. But the point is, when Giuliani came on the scene in 1994, what he did was he recognized the value of all this, the wisdom in it. So now you had leadership from the top. You had Giuliani hiring the right people, embracing the right policies. And it reminds me, Gary, of something that Niccolo Machiavelli said in The Prince. He said, if a leader doesn't have wisdom, then all is for naught, because he's not going to know enough to appoint or choose the right people to be around him. Giuliani, to his credit, had that wisdom. And that's what a real leader does. He knows who to hire. He knows what policies to embrace. So that's what Giuliani did. And stop me if I'm going on too long. But of course, there's a lot more that can be said. For instance, in New York City, they originated a new method of fighting crime known as CompStat, and that's computer statistics as relating to crime fighting. Now, an entity that I cited in my article put it very well, analogizing the matter. What they said is that this is something that is like this. Let's say you walked into a store, and instead of having all those signs up high telling you what each aisle contained, those were absent, and you just had to roam around looking for what you wanted. Now, you might stumble upon what you wanted, and eventually you'd find it, but you'd waste a lot of time. It was the same thing with crime fighting prior to CompStat, because what they did with CompStat, which was originated actually by a New York City transit cop named Jack Maple. It started with just these charts he would put on the wall that he called charts of the future, with pins in them pointing to where the crime was in the New York City, the hot spots. What CompStat did was they put together statistics relating to crime. For instance, where the hot spots were, where you should deploy resources, where crime would be likely to occur, what was working, what wasn't working. There would be relentless follow-up. So they really made it scientific. And what happened was soon afterwards, this methodology started spreading to other cities. And there was an intellectual, a college professor, who actually said some years ago that during the previous 24 years, there was no innovation coming out of New York City that saved more lives than CompStat. So that was a factor. But, you know, I just want to point out that, as I said in my article, none of this is rocket science, okay? You may have something new come down the pike like CompStat, Gary, but most of what the city did was good old-fashioned crime fighting,
Right.
hiring more cops, arresting more perpetrators, administering punishment sufficient to deter the crime. So what deters crime is the same thing that deterred crime 100 years ago, because human nature doesn't change. And, you know, it's funny. What occurs to me here, Gary, is something that G.K. Chesterton said. As you know, at the New American, I never cite him. But he said, I'm paraphrasing now, Men look towards new ideas because they're afraid to look backwards at old ideas. And I would add to that that we don't need any new ideas here. We need eternal ideas. We know what works to quell crime. And something else Chesterton said is 9 out of 10 of what we call new ideas are simply old mistakes. And that applies here as well. So New York City had this triumph where it really quelled crime and became, as the Los Angeles Times put it in 1997, the safest big city in the nation, an unbelievable transformation. But now, unfortunately, that all has been squandered because, as the philosopher Georg Hegel puts it, we learn from history that we do not learn from history. And now we're going back to soft on crime policies. They were justified in the 60s and 70s, as you may remember, Gary, with the idea that rehabilitation should be favored over punishment. And that misses the point that punishment is rehabilitation if it's properly administered, because through punishment, people learn to be better. But now we're doing it in the name of, well, there are these underlying causes, white supremacy, supposedly, systemic racism, and these are the things you have to address. And of course, all of this is very, very misguided because we know that there are underlying causes to crime, as there is to everything else, right? Or as there are to everything else, I should say. But that doesn't change the fact that you still have to administer symptomatic treatment. I mean, it's like if you go to a doctor. When I had kidney stones, of course, we wanted to eliminate the stones, but at the same time, the doctor administered symptomatic treatment because I was in pain. And if you have a patient who's screaming in pain, and our big cities are screaming in pain, beset by crime, you have to administer that symptomatic treatment no matter what you think the root causes are. Of course, that said, the left is all wrong about the root causes. The root causes are our moral breakdown and the tone that we've set through these left-wing policies, no cash bail, so on and so forth, this turnstile justice or injustice where criminals are put right back onto the street. I mean, it's a terrible thing. And real people suffer because of this, Gary. It's just unbelievable.
Right.
And I'll also say, I know time is growing short, but I really believe that one of the things that underlies this left-wing DA mentality where they don't want to punish criminals is this idea that they have that, well, you know, these are the root causes here, systemic racism, so on and so forth. And you know what? If you're not going to address that, if you're not going to go along with our agenda, you're going to suffer. And the reason why I've theorized about this many a time is that you saw this with the communists too. They would starve the peasants to death. And I think a big motivating factor there was similar, that Gary, no one likes it when a monkey wrench is thrown into his plans. And what left-wingers do, whether it was with the communists or today with crime, is they institute some program that's completely unrealistic and unworkable because it ignores the realities of human nature. And then when it inevitably doesn't work, they externalize and they blame someone else. They basically say, well, it's the fault of all you ignorant yahoos because you won't go along with our plans. You're not good enough to make this utopia work, and therefore you're going to suffer until you change.
I'm sure, Selwyn, that some people believe their own propaganda, and maybe even some DAs believe their own propaganda, but obviously there are others who are smart enough to know that their policies are disastrous. And maybe that's your point, that they're doing it for a purpose, because if they can create moral anarchy, if they can create crime to a point where people can no longer tolerate that crime, where people are fleeing from the cities and people are afraid to leave their homes. And of course, the biggest victims of these crimes in the inner cities would be the minority populations, such as the black people and Hispanics and whatnot. But if they can create those conditions, they can then use that as a rationale for somebody else to step in and take over. In other words, to tear down the existing system and to build in its place their new world order. Do you think that's part of what's happening?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Listen, I always point out, Gary, that people are not simple, they're complex beings. So anytime you observe a phenomenon, you have to understand that there are going to be multiple motivations at work. Sometimes within one person, a person can do something having multiple motivations. So there's no question, I think, that there are certain people, Machiavellian types out there, who do want to destabilize society, because if you want to take over, that's what you have to do, destabilize the existing order foment revolution, so then you can come riding in like a faux white knight on a big white horse, claiming that you can restore order. And then once you do that, you cement your power, and then you have control thenceforth. That's the whole idea, sure.
One final question, someone regarding New York City. Is crime about where it was when it was at its peak back in 1990 or thereabouts? And also, what can be done today to bring down the crime rate if they really wanted to accomplish that?
Yeah, I don't know if it's where it was when it was at its peak, but it's certainly getting there. And you have to think that it will get there if we continue in this vein, because it's inevitable. You allow social breakdown, what else is going to happen? As to what you do to right the ship, again, you have to apply these eternal principles. You simply punish criminals in a way that's proportionate to the crime and sufficient to deter the crime. You put more police on the streets. You don't handcuff them. That's very important. You arrest more criminals. And not handcuffing the police is very important, because you know as well as I do, Gary, that in recent years, we've seen this phenomenon whereby the police now are afraid to act. They
Right.
have to worry that if they clamp down on the wrong criminal, if the person happens to be a black suspect, they can be dragged through the mud in the media. Their career can be ruined. They can get death threats. And it's sort of like our military endeavors overseas, where you see these ridiculous rules of engagement. The rules of engagement have to be realistic, and we have to give the benefit to law enforcement. I mean, you need to have police, and everyone understands and accepts that, except maybe the people who want to
Right.
eliminate our police and replace them with a federalized police force, right?
Right. And of course, to want a police force is not to want a national police force, and it's not to want violations of the Constitution. Obviously,
Right.
the Constitution should be honored, but the irony here is that by letting the crime wave reach a point where it basically destabilizes the country, that is going to lead to the loss of the Constitution if the policies are not reversed. Selwyn, thank you so much for coming on the program, and we encourage all our viewers to read your article about how New York City won the war against crime back in the 1990s, and we'll have a link to that article in the description to this video.
Thank you, Gary. Great
Thank
to be
you.
with you, and God bless you and the audience.
God bless you.